I usually doesn't. I don't.
Stand up.
Well, I'm not photogenic at all. Shall I start again? Yes. I would like to welcome you all to the first formal university seminar on Columbia School Linguistics in this new hall. I hope, and we all hope, that this association will enable that the legacy of Professor Diver, his teaching and his theory, and also of that of his students will be preserved at Columbia University. I'm in particular happy that our first speaker is one of ours. I'll back up a little bit, saying about legacy of Professor Diver. It's not that we didn't do anything to preserve that legacy. Our members worked very hard and in some instances sacrificed their careers to preserve that legacy, but now this is within Columbia University, his former alma mater and his school. I would like to call on Professor Ricardo Otegui to present our speaker for tonight. Ricardo.
Thank you. People who have introduced Wally in the past, I'm sure, have talked about his incisive thinking about linguistics, his work on the passive simple and the imparfait, his work on verb and noun number in English, and his many letters and papers. But what do you say when the person you want to introduce is the person from whom you've learned most of your linguistics and also a very good friend? Well, you can talk, it occurred to me, you can talk about two hats. And if I had two hats, I could do it. And there is always a hat that we wear as a friend to someone, and there is always a hat that we wear as a thinker and critic of both linguistic analysis and foundational issues in linguistics. Most people never really take off the friend hat completely when they put the linguist hat on, and there's always a certain amount of consideration for their friends when they talk to their friends about language and when they point out their mistakes and the ways in which they're thinking incorrectly. Wally is most unusual in that he always keeps the two hats very separate. Having been the victim of this for more than 30 years, I can assure you that Wally's very, very careful thinking about linguistics can be devastating to anything you think or say that he doesn't think makes sense. And for that, I admire Wally even more than for all the other good things that he has written and thought about. It is, as you know, Wally is an emeritus professor from Rutgers University, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Wallis Reid.
Thank you very much for coming all out and attending this first meeting. As you know, this is sort of a quickly arranged affair. I actually only had 7 days to write my paper. And I never could have done that if I didn't have some reserved material. And I happen to have the reserved material in the form of some emails that I had written to Joss Ruggles over here, who began attending the seminar last November. And she began writing some questions about Columbia School Linguistics. And I answered several of them, and then she wrote me a long email in December with a whole list of questions. And I was struck by, she'd read quite a lot of the materials, and she was asking very foundational questions like, what do you study? And do you analyze messages? So I realized this, some of these basic questions were not coming through in the literature, and so I began a long answer. I got the three pages, single-spaced pages, but then Christmas came and Marcel's paper, and I never got it all. So Josh, you should hear this paper as the email I owed you from last December. There's a handout. And the paper, I read it yesterday, and it took just a little over 45 minutes, so I was afraid I had an hour paper. So I'm going to read a little slower than I did yesterday, because I think that would help. And I'm going to stop after, well, I'll tell you about that in a second. All right. You don't have to take notes.
Okay, now I have it.
All right. My topic today is the role of communication in Columbia School theory, and I will be saying that it plays an important role. No surprise here. Anyone familiar with the history of diverse thinking knows that its starting point, back in the mid-60s, was Saussure's conception of a language as a system of linguistic signs. Diver saw Saussure as introducing a communicative orientation toward language. In view of this, one would assume that Columbia School linguists study, well, communication. But this is not the case. And my talk today will explicate this paradox. The paradox is this. The Columbia School framework takes the communicative function of language as the key to the nature of linguistic structure. It analyzes that structure as essentially semantic. It addresses distributional facts drawn primarily from natural language use, natural discourse, and it accounts for those facts in terms of the speaker's communicative intent. Nevertheless, Columbia School does not offer a theory of communication, as that term is commonly understood. Nor does it offer a theory of meaning, as philosophers understand the term. Neither of these endeavors is in fact feasible from the Columbia School perspective. So what exactly does it study? What does it explain? What does it have to offer? I will answer these questions by developing a line of thinking that culminates in a rather unorthodox conception of the linguistic enterprise. This paper has two parts, and the first part is called sound, and the second part is called sense. And the first part is about 25 minutes, and I'm going to stop then and a little pause, let you ask any informational questions before I continue the second part. We all know how the layperson would describe what linguists study. Linguists study languages, right? Well, yes and no. It makes sense to talk of an astronomer studying stars, a biologist studying some animal, and a chemist analyzing a particular substance. In all these cases, there exist observable objects or natural phenomena prior to the actual studying. That is to say, there exist pre-theoretical things that can then be investigated, analyzed, described, and studied. But Saussure pointed out that this was not the case with language. There are no languages there to study or describe. Not at any rate a language in the sense of a structured system with observable units. In fact, neither are there sentences, clauses, subjects, predicates, objects, complements, nouns, verbs, morphemes, or phonemes for the linguist to study. Those are all theoretical constructs that emerge well down the line. Instead, all that is there to observe directly are individual speech acts, each consisting of a perceptible continuum of sound that often triggers mental experience in us. So what gets the linguistic enterprise started is not what questions that observation, study, and analysis can answer, but a why question. For Diver, explanation must be the goal from the start. If we were to imagine a linguist beginning absolutely from scratch, that is, prior to the establishment of linguistic units or abstractions like a language, the why questions would have to be posed in purely acoustic terms. Why did a speaker make a particular sound? Why does a particular sequence of sounds occur from time to time? These are questions that one could ask even if one understood nothing of what was being said. That is to say, even in the absence of any associated mental experience. In attempting to answer such a question, the analyst must make an initial commitment to the nature of the phenomena. This is the point at which the pre-theoretical version of the problem is transformed into one shaped by a theoretical framework. For the Columbia School linguist, that initial commitment is in the form of the working hypothesis that the stream of sound is a consequence of a speaker attempting to communicate using a code system. That is, a system comprised of phonological forms with semantic values, what Saussure called signifiants and signifiés, and what Columbia School analysts called signals and meanings. This conceptual framework is what Diver meant by his communicative orientation. It is important to understand that this commitment is a good deal more than simply a recognition of the communicative function of language. Linguists of all stripes are happy to acknowledge that, and it has never been in dispute. Nor is it a claim that communication is the most important function of language. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. Rather, it is the working hypothesis that language is essentially, rather than only accidentally, a communicative system. And as such, the exigencies of communication can serve as theoretical motivation for hypotheses about its structure. Thus, the pre-theoretical problem of why particular sounds and sound sequences occur in particular patterns and frequency becomes the theory-shaped problem of explaining the occurrence of those sounds and patterns as a manifestation of signals that the speaker has chosen because their meanings contribute to the communication of the speaker's intended message. The problem has become one of human behavior, why people have done certain things. If we were having our normal Friday morning seminar, this is the moment that Ricardo would point out that he cannot recall anyone ever coming to the seminar wanting help in figuring out why some speaker has made a nasal sound. And of course he would be right. Diver acknowledged that in practice we ask our why questions about the distribution of morphemes, units which we accept as provisional hypotheses about the identity of signals. The justification for this practical step is the fact that morphemes are themselves rough and ready products of a communicative orientation. Recall that the analytical procedures of the descriptive linguist that yield morphemes, techniques based on distinctiveness of meaning, derive from the notion of a language as a communicative system consisting of forms with semantic values that Bloomfield called sememes. So, asking our initial why questions about morphemes rather than the phonetic characteristics of the stream of speech is not a deviation from our communicative orientation. Phonemes, however, are a different story. While the same analytical techniques yielding morphemes also yield phonemes, nothing in the nature of communication calls for phonemes. Their deductive motivation comes instead from a second theoretical orientation that Diver added in the early 70s, what he called the human factor orientation. This was his cover term for a range of general psychological and physiological characteristics that impact both linguistic structure and language use. Phonemes facilitate language acquisition by drastically reducing the number of unique articulatory gestures that must be mastered. Without phonemes, they would number in the thousands. With phonemes, only several score. At this point, you may wonder why Diver maintained the fiction that he began with questions about raw sound, when in fact he never did. This was Diver's way of blocking any attempt to introduce a priori notions or illicit abstractions early in the inquiry that would guarantee its failure. What Diver had in mind here, of course, were the categories of the linguistic tradition that I mentioned earlier. Categories such as sentence and parts of speech, processes such as pronominalization, normative concerns of grammatical correctness, even, as we will see shortly, the notion of sentence meaning. All of these he regarded as unsuitable starting points for linguistic inquiry. The danger of dooming one's inquiry by framing it in terms of unjustified abstractions is a real one, and I would like to illustrate this point with a personal example. All the research I have read to date dealing with the so-called verbal S in English is billed as a study of agreement, as if agreement were a pre-analytical category of objective description, the name of a natural phenomenon like the tides that needs to be studied and explained. But of course it isn't. Subject-verb agreement is a hypothesis, a proposed explanation for the frequent appearance of one sibilant morpheme in particular contexts. The danger of allowing a hypothesis to masquerade as a descriptive category is that by doing so, it escapes testing. In my case, counter-evidence to subject-verb agreement is always treated as indicating the need to narrow its definition, introduce a distinction between notional agreement and formal agreement, or as indicating the need for further tinkering with the agreement mechanism. It never seems to provoke a reconsideration of the basic hypothesis because agreement is not recognized as a hypothesis open to falsification. It's just the name of the object of study. Returning now to Diver's somewhat fanciful idealization of how linguistic analysis gets started, let us consider what would happen if the initial why questions were actually couched in purely acoustic terms. For example, why did this particular speaker make 6 sibilant sounds in saying what would be written as she sells seashells? Figure 1 on your handout. Our communicative and human factor orientations lead us to suspect, even if we did not know English, that this question has no single answer because each sibilant sound is likely to be there for a different reason. And finding the reason for each sibilant sound involves positing units of linguistic structure. A phonemic analysis based on minimal pair contrasts leads us to distinguish the initial sibilant sounds of she and shells from those of sea, cells, and the final sibilant of shells. Then to distinguish between the voiced and voiceless versions of the latter, s and z. A morphemic analysis tells us that each occurrence of the 3 phonological units sh, s, z is a constituent of a different morpheme, and therefore must have a different explanation. These various explanations take the form of the meaning the analyst posits for each morpheme or sigma. Those of you familiar with my work on grammatical number know that I posit the meaning one third-person entity in focus for the z of cells, a meaning that is a member of a grammatical system I call the focus number system. That's figure 2 in your handout. That meaning, one entity in focus, is the starting point for my answer to the question, why is there a sibilant sound at the ends of cells in she sells seashells? The question, why does that same sibilant sound occur at the end of shells, has a different answer, namely the meaning one entity, a member of my entity number system. It's more than one entity, sorry. That's figure 3 on your handout. The 4 other sibilant sounds would be accounted for in the course of positing she as a member of a pronominal system and positing the lexical signs cell, shell, sea, and shore. Eventually, the analyst would be able to answer the initial pre-theoretical question, why did the speaker make 6 sibilant sounds in the utterance she sells seashells? But the multiplicity of answers to a single question also underscores the fact that it is fruitful to move as soon as possible from questions posed in pre-theoretical terms, the occurrence of sibilants, to questions posed in theory-internal terms of hypothesized units of linguistic structure, the distributions of signals in discourse. Let me pause here and restate and emphasize the point that I have just made about the status of linguistic structure within the Columbia School framework. Linguistic structure is not the object of study, something that is first described and later explained. Features of linguistic structure, like my focus number system, are themselves explanations. Or, to be more accurate, they are theoretical constructs that establish an explanatory link between the distribution of signals and the messages being communicated. To put this in philosophical terms, linguistic structure is not the explicandum, that which is being explained. It is part of the explicans. The explanation of what Diver insisted was ultimately the asymmetry of the sound waves. Those of you with very long memories may remember from seminar meetings back in the early 70s that Diver's claim that our analyses ultimately address skewings of the sound waves was a point of contention. Erica Garcia regularly challenged Diver to show that this was true. I can see how our analyses explain the distribution of signals, she would say, but that is a theory-defined problem. How does one get from the distribution of signals to skewings in the sound waves? Diver always bristled at this question, because it was, of course, a direct attack on the little empiricist fable he was spinning. He would make a stab at answering, with expressions and hand gestures that implied that any dolt could see the connection. But in the end, he couldn't provide an answer that satisfied Garcia. 20 years later or so, I tried my hand at answering that question in my book, Verb and Noun Number in English. Last week, I read through the section to see if I could trim it for the talk today. But it seemed that I had already written the most condensed version possible for the book, so I will just read you the passage. The tables I refer to are in your handout. And this, I should say, this is chapter 10 after the whole analysis has been presented. What exactly is the connection between the two number systems, and those are the ones in your handout, figures 2 and 3, and the directly perceptible asymmetry of vocal sound we claim they are addressing? What is called for is a demonstration that two number systems are, in fact, responsible for features of the overall acoustic asymmetry of English. The obstacle to such a demonstration is that we have as yet no observational description of that characteristic acoustic asymmetry. What we need at this point is not descriptive categories derived from a phonological or grammatical analysis of English, but rather the kind of rough and ready observational categories such as guttural that the layman often employs to describe the sound of a language he does not know. In other words, we need easily applicable categories with consistent acoustic correlates that will capture features of a characteristic acoustic asymmetry that makes English sound different from, say, French. Sibilants and nasals are two such categories. Sibilants encompass a perceptually prominent range of sounds and are so named because they all seem to hiss. This subjective impression is due to an objective acoustic property, the presence of aperiodic noise variably beginning from 2,500 to 4,000 hertz and ranging up to between 6,000 and 8,000 hertz, produced by the turbulence of air passing between the tongue and the front palate. Likewise, nasals encompass a readily identifiable range of sounds and are so named because they all seem to issue from the nose. Their unique quality is due to an objective acoustic property, the emergence of the third formant as the predominant one due to the weakening of the normally strong first and second formants, caused by the lowering of the velum, that characterize oral sound. These two phonetic categories are ideal for our purposes precisely because they stand in a haphazard and orthogonal relation to the real phonological and morphological categories of English. Each is at best a cover category for a number of sounds that are actually different phonemes, each occurring in thousands of different signals. Our demonstration will take the form of an illustration of how the characteristic acoustic patterning of English would be altered in the absence of the two number systems. The difference between the acoustic patterning of English with and without the two number systems constitutes that portion of its overall acoustic asymmetry for which the two number systems are responsible. As a representative sample of English, we will employ the James Smiley short story Long Distance. The first step is to count the number of sibilant and nasal sounds. This is done by reading the text aloud and counting each instance of a nasal and sibilant sound perceived. 2,503 nasal sounds and 2,424 sibilant sounds were tabulated by the counter, trained in clinical phonetics, while attending to her oral rendition of the text. The next step is to cast some aspect of overall acoustic asymmetry in terms of our two rough and ready categories. Since the categories do not neatly mesh with any phonological or grammatical analysis of English, there is no basis to prefer one descriptive statement to another. All have equal claim to legitimacy, and for present purposes it makes no difference what form it takes, so long as it manages to encompass instances of the signals of the two number systems. The most straightforward statement of observational fact is the ratio of sibilant to nasal sounds. And this is table 10.1 on your handout. As you see in table 10.1, the ratio of sibilant sounds to nasal sounds is 0.97, a departure from symmetrical distribution of 0.03. Similar calculations by the same counter, following the same procedure, were conducted on 700-word texts of French, German, Spanish, and Russian. The differing ratios reflect how these other languages sound different from English along one objectively measurable parameter. So table 10.2, ratio of sibilant sounds to nasal sounds in French, German, Spanish, and Russians. In French, the ratio was 0.67, German 0.74, Spanish 0.94, and Russian, and I know Ricardo's going to ask me which version of Spanish, because that's crucial with sibilants. Russian 1.01. The third step is to calculate what the ratio between sibilants and nasals would be if neither of our two number systems existed, while everything else remained the same. This is done by recounting the number of sibilants and nasals in the oral text, this time omitting all instances that are manifestations of the signals in the two number systems. Table 10.3, that's the sibilant, that's without the two number systems. It can be seen that in the absence of the two number systems, the overall ratio of sibilant to nasal sounds would drop from 0.97 to 0.66. Put another way, the directly observable consequence of the two hypothesized number systems is that the ratio of sibilants to nasals in one particular text is 0.97 rather than 0.66. A ratio which would make it sound, in one respect at least, more like the sample of French. This initial calculation can be broken down so as to show the effect of the entity number system and the focus number system individually. This breakdown reveals that in the absence of the entity number system, the ratio would be 0.88, and in the absence of the focus number system, the ratio would be 0.71. The earlier difference of 0.31 between the calculated and observed ratios 0.66 and 0.97 can now be seen to be due chiefly to the existence of the focus number system in English. And the focus number system is the third person S on English verbs. It is not the existence of the signals alone that contributes to the overall acoustic asymmetry. It is the signals together with their hypothesized meanings. If their meanings were different, their effect would be different. This can be illustrated by calculating what the ratio between sibilant and nasal sounds would be if, say, the signals and meanings in each system remained the same, but their pairings were reversed. That is, singular nouns would be marked with an S, and plural nouns would be marked with a zero signal. Table 10.4. Sibilant and nasal sounds with the entity numbers and meanings reversed. Table 10.4 reveals that if the structure of English were slightly different from what it actually is, the ratio between sibilant and nasal sounds in this particular text would rise from 0.97 to 1.29. A similar calculation with a pairing of the signals and meanings in the focus number system reversed reveals that the ratio would drop from 0.97 to 0.74, making it sound more like the sample of German. In summary, the calculations show that the existence and structure of the two number systems contribute in demonstrable ways to the overall acoustic asymmetry of English. These two theoretical constructs are thus ultimately justified because they help to establish an explanatory link, via the analysis of the whole book, between general goal-directed principles of human behavior as applied to the messages people wish to communicate and the acoustic asymmetry of English. That's the end of part one. Part two, sense. I have now completed the first part of my talk about the role of communication in Columbia School theory. It reformulates the pre-theoretical problem of acoustic asymmetry in theory-based terms, and it supplies deductive motivation for hypotheses about linguistic structure. But I have not yet provided a resolution to the grand paradox I alluded to at the outset. Quite the contrary, in fact. A while back, I said that features of linguistic structure serve to create an explanatory connection between sound and messages. This sounds like familiar descriptions of the basic problem confronting all linguists. A problem I recall Macaulay describing as that of stating the relation between sound and sense. So to date, it appears that looking at language as a communicative system and looking at language as a representational system of sentential meaning have the linguists tackling much the same problem. Columbia School linguists have a stock answer for why they do not go down that path. The message is a product of many things, linguistic input being only one. But that answer can be interpreted as simply a call for a more grandiose theory, one with an encyclopedic component, a pragmatic component that formalizes amalgamation rules that integrate information from many sources. Such a theory would presumably provide a full account of linguistic communication. So this afternoon, I would like to explore a deeper reason for not going that route. One that I believe stems, again, from an insight of Saussure. This insight is portrayed visually in a picture in Chapter 4 of the Cours. It is a drawing of two rivers flowing in parallel, one a river of sound, and the other a river of thought. And that's figure 4 on your handout. Psychologically, our thought, apart from its expression in words, is only a shapeless and indistinct mass, says Saussure. Without language, thought is a vague, uncharted nebula. There are no pre-existing ideas, and nothing is distinct before the appearance of language. He goes on to argue that the only justification for a partitioning on one side is its rule-governed correlation with a partitioning on the other side. Diver turned this into an aphorism that we all know by heart. You don't know if you have a signal until you have a meaning that goes with it. And you don't know if you have a meaning until you have a signal that goes with it. But Saussure's insight about the formless nature of pre-linguistic thought has implications beyond that of simply offering a control on the positing of linguistic signs. It is the reason we don't go down the analytical path of attempting to state the relation between sound and sense, a reason I will now develop. Let us reflect on what that analytical path would entail. A moment's thought makes us realize that the phrase sound and sense is a touch disingenuous because it obscures two necessary steps. In order to spell out the relation between sound and sense, the sound must be analyzed into discrete units, and the sense must be analyzed into conceptual components. These two steps are explicitly acknowledged in various genitive versions of what syntax does. Standard theory saw syntax as simultaneously mapping to both phonological representations and semantic representations. Government binding theory sees syntax as mapping phonological representations to logical form. So the question is whether the Columbia School linguist, in the course of an analysis, creates two such representations between which it is possible to map. And if not, why not? Certainly, there is a representation for the sound side. The acoustic stream of speech is analyzed into discrete signals composed of phonemes. But what about the sense side? Does the Columbia School analyst analyze the messages people communicate? Well, yes, in the basic sense of the word analyze, to break something into parts. In the course of testing a meaning hypothesis, a Columbia School linguist does break a message down into parts, but not into its parts. And therein lies the reason for the path not taken. Let me first give you a simple example of this difference before continuing. To clean an old-fashioned mechanical watch, the watchmaker disassembled it into its parts. They were its parts because they comprised the internal structure of the watch. When the watch was cleaned again, it was disassembled into the same set of parts. On the other hand, if one drops a china plate on a tile floor, it breaks into parts, but not into its parts. If an identical plate were dropped, the result would be a different number of parts with different shapes. If the same said plate had been hurled rather than dropped, again, the parts would be different. In the case of the plate, the shards of china are not parts of its internal structure. I will be arguing that something like this holds for the analysis of messages. The analysis of messages thus differs from other kinds of scientific analysis. Say a chemist analyzing an unknown substance found in a passenger's carry-on bag. The chemist is trying to answer a what question. What is this substance? And the chemist is confident that the question has a single definite answer that another chemist would find as well, because the substance presumably had a specific chemical identity prior to the analysis. By contrast, the Columbia School linguist is not attempting to answer a what question when he or she analyzes a message. That is, the analyst is not trying to answer the question, what is the internal structure of this message? Rather, the analyst is answering a why question. Why has the speaker or writer chosen a particular meaning at this point in the discourse? And the answer presumably lies in the message being communicated. But when the Columbia School linguist speaks of the message, what he or she is referring to is simply that stretch of our ongoing mental experience relevant to explaining the occurrence of a particular linguistic sign. If a different sign were being accounted for, the analyst would be appealing to a different, though perhaps overlapping, stretch, and perhaps describe it in a different, though equally legitimate, way, because a different linguistic sign is being accounted for. For example, in testing a control system analysis, the relevant stretch of message is usually of clause length, and it is analyzed into partials that reflect the relative control different participants exercise over the activity expressed by the verb. Partials such as causer, motivator, cooperative party, enabler. Descriptive categories that mesh with the meaning hypotheses being tested. On the other hand, a focus system analysis, in a focus system analysis, the relevant stretch of the message is likely to be the entire discourse, which for a novel could be the whole novel. And the message of the novel would be analyzed using the categories such as main and minor character, descriptions motivated by the focus meanings being tested. This means that a message is defined, that is to say, bounded and described, contingently in response to the particular analysis being validated. It has no natural boundaries or determinate structure outside the context of that analytical endeavor. The Columbia School of Literature has not exactly been forthcoming on this point. I can't think offhand of anywhere it is stated as baldly as I am doing here, even in Diver's own writings or my own, and perhaps with good reason. The Columbia School framework is already a hard sell. Why highlight a feature that would make it even less appealing? So Columbia School analyses talk about messages in ways that allow readers to think of them as discrete, bounded objects of roughly sentence dimensions. But this is not the case, and perhaps more should be made of this radical feature of the Columbia School framework because it could well be Diver's most brilliant stroke. The one by which he separated linguistics from speculative philosophy, freeing it from the Platonic idealism that has shaped Western linguistics from the beginning. That Platonic path began with the Greeks and their concern with language as a vehicle for the expression of logical propositions, a perspective that evolved into traditional grammar's definition of a sentence as the expression of a complete thought. This portrays thought, insofar as it is expressed linguistically at any rate, as comprised of separate bounded thoughts, which have internal structure that makes them either complete or incomplete. Modern linguists don't talk about thoughts anymore. They speak of sentence meaning, logical form, propositional structure, but they retain the idea of the existence of complex, invisible semantic objects that are bounded, structured, and perceptible, and hence both amenable to formal representation and in need of explanation. This is the idea that Diver abandoned. Whereas for many linguists, these semantic objects have an existence independent of the human minds that experience them, like numbers for the mathematician. For Diver, if I am channeling him correctly, there is only ongoing personal mental experience. This experience is polymorphous and multifaceted for the experiencer, open to many descriptions that are equally accurate and equally legitimate when considered by themselves. This was Saussure's point about the thought continuum. The Columbia School analyst fashions the description that best illuminates the semantic fit between the ongoing message and the fixed and constant meaning of a linguistic sign on that particular occasion of its use. But, to repeat, if the analyst were accounting for the appearance of another linguistic sign also chosen on that occasion, the analyst might describe the message in a different way because a different linguistic meaning is being tested, a meaning which inspires different descriptive categories. So the reason the Columbia School linguist does not attempt to construct a representation of the message as a whole and then map between it and linguistic signs is that there is no single, stable, and discrete whole. The analyst has access to the ongoing message as speaker of the language, and constantly appeals to it in the course of accounting for linguistic choices, but he or she has no responsibility beyond that. The analyst is not attempting to provide an account of the communicative process. The reason, to repeat, is that there are no messages. There are no discrete messages, no propositions, no logical form, no utterance meanings that fall within language as a structured system. There is just continuous, ongoing mental experience for both the speaker and hearer, one of Saussure's rivers. And that mental experience lies outside language itself in the realm of language use, because it only comes into existence in a communicative act. The relation between what speakers wish to communicate and the utterances that they produce is thus not one appropriately expressed by system internal mapping rules. Rather, the relation is one of psychological motivation. A particular feature of the ongoing message is the reason why a speaker chooses a particular linguistic sign. It is in this sense that Columbia School deals with language use as goal-directed behavior. For some of you here this afternoon, what I have just said may ring familiar bells. For it turns out that Columbia School linguists maintain a firm distinction between grammar and use. Moreover, they are fierce proponents of the autonomy of grammar. This is actually a realization I came to just a few months ago. For most of our careers, we Columbia School linguists have dismissed Chomsky's position on the autonomy of grammar with knowing smiles. But last September, after reading an article by Fritz Neumeyer, I realized with some chagrin that we too were proponents of autonomous grammar. At least in the more comprehensive sense Neumeyer now defines that term. I realized in retrospect that our disagreement with Chomsky had been on the particular conception of linguistic structure he was proposing. But setting aside that difference, we insist on the autonomy of grammar to a degree that might give even its most staunch advocates pause. This autonomy is manifested in two ways. First, a Columbia School grammatical system is synchronically arbitrary and irreducible, not derivable from anything outside language. Second, the Columbia School analyst only builds into the grammar itself those features of the conceptual and logical structure of messages that are directly signaled. Building in any more would be crossing the boundary between grammar and use. Conclusion. I've come to the end of my story, and I hope it has resolved the paradox I began with. Columbia School is a theory that adopts a communicative orientation toward language, yet it is not a theory of communication because it does not explain how messages are communicated. Nor does it offer a theory of meaning, for a reason I hope you can now see. The notion of a theory of meaning comes from erroneously taking meaning, in the non-technical sense, to be a feature of the natural world in need of explanation. Columbia School turns this conventional view on its head by saying that meaning, as it pertains to language at any rate, is not something in need of explanation because it is already an explanation. And asking for an explanation of an explanation is the first step in an infinite regress. Meaning, and this is meaning in quotation marks, is the explanation created by hearers for why a speaker has made particular sounds. The speaker wants to communicate something and chooses a series of linguistic signs that best serve that communicative goal. The interlocutor assumes that the speaker is trying to communicate something and creates a message that would serve as the best motivation, the best explanation for the speaker's choice of linguistic signs. Linguistic comprehension is thus a particular instance of understanding people's behavior in general. We make other people's behavior meaningful to us. We understand it by ascribing motivations and goals to them that make their behavior rational, something we would do in the same circumstances. All this can now be rephrased in terms of my earlier point that for Columbia School, the relation between linguistic structure and language use is that of explicans to explicandum. Meaning functions as explicans in two ways. Meaning, understood as a feature of linguistic structure, namely the hypothesized semantic value of a signal, is the analyst's explanation for the distribution of that signal in discourse. Meaning, now understood as a part of language use, a message, is the hearer's explanation for why the speaker has produced a particular stream of speech sounds. In neither of these two senses, meaning as saussurian signifié and meaning as message, can it be derived from what it helps to explain, because for both the analyst and the user, there is a semantic gap between the meanings of linguistic signs and the messages they help to communicate that must be bridged by creative imagination.